You'll notice it's funny. I think it's funny that I'm moderating a panel about molecules, and most of the panelists are doctors. I guess Vince and I are the recovering lawyers on the panel, but he'll certainly know a lot more about this topic than me. Before we get going, though, I did want to say just a quick reflection. I mean, I got to work with the Council on Competitiveness several years ago when I was in the administration out in Washington, leading the Economic Development Administration, and got to know Deb, and I really appreciated all the support and learnings that I gathered from this organization. They were started in 1986, and today, we're here talking about these incredible partnerships between industry, academia, the private sector, working towards the kinds of policies and co-investments that can really make and continue to make our economies very competitive on a global scale. It hasn't always been that way. I mean, if you think about it, back in '86 and even in recent years, when we used to talk about these kinds of deep investments by the government into specific technology areas or trying to drive particularly industries, we were always accused of trying to create industrial policy and how that was a really bad thing. I think it's refreshing that today we're not even having that debate. Now it's more about how are we leveraging these capabilities of just incredible research opportunities in private sector and academia, how we bring our government into it as an enabler, as a catalyst, and building the kind of partnerships that can really elevate our game and keep us globally competitive going forward. So I just want to thank the Council for their continued work in leading this effort. And speaking of partnerships, I wanted to just jump right in and maybe go to you, Joanna, and talk about, when we talk about these partnerships, which ones work best, and what are some of the key elements that make these kind of 3P or public-private and government partnerships work well in this area of driving deep science and translational research, particularly in this area of biosciences, molecules?
Of course. The probably driving factor of the partnerships in the Chicagoland region and the Illinois-Indiana corridor, I think, stem from the culture of this part of the United States. It is highly collaborative, yet it is based in a well-defined large university network. It is based on those who wish to work with one another to address the big questions that affect all of us, I think, across the world and in our local region as well as the United States. Many of the consortia that already exist in this part of the country also demonstrate, I think, that great collegiality and are highly productive. Say the Chicago Biomedical Consortium has been supported by private foundations in the city of Chicago for many, many years. It allows us to develop an entrepreneurial culture, to move the discoveries from the three universities, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, and Northwestern, into startups, into developing the next generation of entrepreneurial scientists, and does so also in a way that allows us to share our infrastructure at the universities. So we can move the discovery portfolio into more of the applied and innovation portfolio. So I think those are simple answers. It's the region, it's that sense of place, it's the long-standing ability to address big questions in this part of the country, and to use that really fabulous university network to do that. It's also fueled by sports.
Yeah. and I guess, Andrew, from a industry perspective, what are you looking for when you're trying to build these kinds of partnerships with the universities?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think one of the examples I could use to illustrate that is the strategic research partnership that we have at Lilly with Purdue, because that's actually been focused on a lot of the areas that I'm responsible for at the company in terms of the new types of medicines that we're trying to make. Probably through COVID, most of us got exposed for the first time to things like RNA-based medicines through the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. But we as a company see a future where those kinds of medicines become much more commonplace and where we can take them to diseases like Alzheimer's and diabetes. But if we want to do that, there's still actually a lot of technical problems that we need to figure out first, right? If you think about it, If I need to give a medicine that gets to the brain today, if that's an RNA-based medicine, I need to inject it intrathecally into the base of your spine, and then it travels up the CSF and into your brain. We actually don't really know much about how that works, about how the CSF flow actually works, but some of our colleagues here at Purdue, as part of the strategic collaboration we have with them, have been working on things like using machine learning to map the flow of CSF, of 3D printing spinal cords and brains and modeling how those flows happen. And that, for us then, helps us make better medicines that more effectively treat patients. But the key is finding those right expertise. And ideally for us, it's finding them at places where our scientists can interact frequently with the people on the other side. In the Purdue collaboration, we have frequent JSCs here and also at the Lilly headquarters in Indianapolis, where we have people going back and forth, and you get that crosstalk that you need to make science work. So I think that's a great example of really the interactivity and the expertise that you really need to forge those strong partnerships.
You know, both of you brought up the concept of building kind of startups and using some of these early stage companies to drive some of the innovation. I was just wondering, Caleb, from your perspective as a relatively young company, how's that fit into your world?
Yeah, in terms of public-private partnerships, I think it's absolutely critical. So I founded STEMloop in 2019 based on my work as a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University at the Center for Synthetic Biology there. And some of the early things that you have to solve if you are a startup founder, especially in the deep tech space, is where do I work? How do I get lab space? Right? How do I get funding to do early proof of concept experiments? How do I do all of the things that allow you to sort of cross what's known as the innovation valley of death? In our case, I was really lucky to be accepted into the third cohort of a program called Chain Reaction Innovations at Argonne National Laboratory that did exactly that. It gave me a fellowship. It provided me with lab space within Argonne, provided me with office space within Argonne, gave me the runway that I needed to do important things like customer discovery, fundraising, early de-risking of the technology. So I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, quite frankly, my organization wouldn't exist were it not for public support. We've been the recipient of a lot of government grant funding, a lot of government contracts, and again, like none of that would have been possible if the public component didn't exist.
Yeah, I guess, Vince, you've been in, I think, probably all three of these different components of the Venn diagram. Do you have any reflections on the, partnership model? And, when you're looking at it today, what are the just essential elements that have to be there for it to function well and be successful?
Yeah, actually, comments that were being made regard to Chicago, actually, there's a lot of echoes in Indianapolis with regard to the public-private partnership and manifestations of that. Back in the 80s, the city leaders had, really made a lot of progress of making Indianapolis and Central Indiana the amateur sports capital of the world. And so their next question is, what's next? And they kind of set their target on life sciences to try to create a center of excellence there. And so thus BioCrossroads was created to really foster that public-private partnership and allow us to punch above our weight by bringing together all the stakeholders from the relative philanthropy, corporate, academia, et cetera. And so out of BioCrossroads has been founded organizations like the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute under the leadership of Dr. Alan Pakovich has really done a wonderful job not only advancing substantive research programs of its own in diabetes and in neurodegenerative disease and also rare pediatric cancers as well, but also has created a really nice incubator space as well that more than 13 or 14 startups are also there as well. So and it's a great place for startups in Indiana to come and have access to really state-of-the-art lab space and analytical equipment as well. And then what we do need in Indiana, in Central Indiana, is graduation spaces for a place for startups to, once they get beyond that valley of death and need a place to scale. That's our next on our agenda is how do we create that graduation space for startups.
So I guess May I start with you, Dr. Adams. When we think about what's going on here in the biosciences world and some of the new advances in technology and such, where do you think, from a comparative advantage perspective, where do you think this Illinois, Indiana kind of corridor can really, succeed and, lead the charge globally? I mean, where are the opportunities that have you excited?
Yeah, there's probably a few places. I think when people think of sort of pharmaceuticals and they think of Lilly, they think of things like Prozac, Mounjaro, and Zepbound now with the GLP-1 wave. But probably what we're thinking about is what comes next. That's mostly what I worry about at the company, is what's coming after those. I think the place where that's going to happen is interacting with people's genomes from a medicine perspective. And so I think that we're in sort of a very fortunate position here in the Indiana-Illinois corridor in terms of having a lot of schools that have expertise in a lot of the technologies that are going to allow us to deliver those medicines. I think nanomedicine is a great example of working with nanoparticles. Purdue's like one of the leading places in the world from an academic perspective. There's also sort of the beamline that we run in Illinois for a lot of our crystallization studies. Those are where I think things are going to go. And, the types of medicines that you can enable with that kind of a technology are things like the Akouos medicine that we recently disclosed some of the data from. It got a New York Times front page story, which doesn't happen often in my work, but it is great when it does happen. We used a gene therapy in that case to take a child who was born completely deaf with a single genetic mutation, and he'd been deaf for 11 years, and then 30 days after receiving this novel innovative gene therapy directly into his inner ear, had hearing that's probably better than most of us in the room. Essentially, normal, complete restoration. That's the kind of one-and-done therapy that I think these new technologies can help us deliver, and I think that the challenge we have to get those technologies to patients is how do we get things like gene editors, gene therapies to new tissues, to new parts of the body. Today, we can do local administration for the eye and the ear. People probably know about the Spark gene therapy for a genetic form of blindness, and now we have the Akouos therapy for hearing. That's because it's a local delivery, and it's a much easier problem. We need to use things like nanoparticles to take these therapies to other tissues, so we can do things like pulmonary fibrosis, asthma, COPD, immunological disorders in the gut. Like, there are all kinds of possibilities, but we really just don't have the technology to get us there yet. And this ecosystem, I think, we could really take the scale of Lilly now, which is very different than the scale of Lilly 14 years ago when I joined the company, and use that in combination with some of the amazing research centers we have in the corridor to really make this the leading place where nanomedicine happens. There's no one that's really taken the lead there yet. You could argue that Boston, as usual, is like kind of close to the front, but I don't think, given the investment that we've made at Lilly and the places like Purdue, that this is without our reach to be the number one place in the long term for nanomedicine.
Sure, I think, Joanna, you want to?
I wanted to add also that the ecosystem of the health systems in larger areas are also really facilitating partners, especially for the pharmaceutical industry. So our health system serves primarily disadvantaged and underrepresented populations. So 70% of our patient base are Black and brown, and people and families who come from underserved communities in Chicago. So what that does is do two things. One is to generate health information that's really important for fueling the algorithms that are predictive and preventive, and not just based on white men. But also it allows access to diverse populations for studies. And sort of going back to this point of genetics, genetics can be individual, but it can also be population-based. So if all our studies are done in men, or all our studies are done in white people, we don't get that same information. So when you partner in different parts of the United States, different urban, suburban, and rural areas, you get an entirely different way of, I think, fueling the healthcare assets that you want to have going forward. And so I think, again, when you think about these big partnerships that we can do, it's the diversity of the universities and the diversity of the places that really allow us all to thrive. And it's so easy, again, going back to a collaborative and open and engaged region of the country like the Midwest.
You know, Vince, and then I'll go to Caleb, but that kind of sounded a bit like Analytics IN, which is a partnership between Indiana University, the medical infrastructure in Indianapolis, Purdue, Notre Dame. Do you want to speak to that and how that might fit in here?
Yeah, I was going to make that point is that Analytics IN is a it's a repository. About 35,000 human samples right now has been sequenced and then linked to phenotypic data through IU Health. We've got patient consents from patients going forward in the IU Health system, which is the largest health system in Indiana, and over time building up that to be a really compelling source of both genotypic and phenotypic data that allow for, I think, some exciting discovery. And actually, Lilly's availing themselves of that database. Root Amino is leading some of that work there to tap into in the areas of around diabetes and also cardiovascular therapy development as well. So it's that collaboration, a spirit of collaboration across universities, pharmaceutical companies, and philanthropy that come together to allow us to make, develop a pretty compelling asset.
Hey, Kyle, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure that we also had the opportunity to sort of broaden the scope. When we talk about life sciences, it's not just health and medicine for humans, right? If we look at the title of this, panel, expanding health spans, right? What about planetary health spans, right? What about economic health spans? And it's important for us in this corridor to think about what makes us really different from the rest of the world. And one of the things that really comes top of mind for me is biomanufacturing, right? How much of the world's corn supply is coming from this region, and how much corn stover or corn waste is generated as a result of that we can then harness and leverage to convert into high-value natural products, right? Creating more economic activity for things that are already happening in this region. And we already have great universities here, right? Purdue, for example, right? Agricultural revolution. We've got the talent here. We've got the feedstock in impressive quantities here. And so there are opportunities beyond just human health that exist in this region.
Yeah, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the kind of One Health concept, looking at where are those intersections between human, plant, and animal health, and where there's some crossover in capabilities, but also learnings that can drive our regional economy. I don't know, I guess when we think about where we're at with all these industries, what are some other areas of convergence? I'll just go back to you, Caleb, in terms of, when we talk about AI, we talk about quantum, we talk about all these just mind-blowing advancements, but where do they converge? Where are there opportunities for things that we haven't yet thought of?
Yeah, so with regards to AI in the life sciences, it's a really exciting time right now because the pace of progress in the entire field is so fast. For anyone that's in the life sciences, we're at a point now where we're starting to solve, to some extent, the protein folding problem. It's important, though, to remember that we're at a point now where you can take any given sequence that codes for a protein and predict what it looks like as a static three-dimensional picture. Proteins, however, are dynamic molecules, and so having static pictures is a start, but there's so much more that we need to do. I think there's a lot of exciting overlap between quantum and life sciences, but honestly, I don't know too much, and so I don't want to make a fool of myself up here.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe I could comment briefly on that. I think it's actually a really interesting time, especially for ML. I guess I'm maybe more bullish on ML than I am even on sort of the broader LLM-based AI approaches because of, it's Caleb's point that the biophysical stuff is taking off really quickly with things like AlphaFold and others pioneering that space. But we've been applying these kinds of ML ideas to things like molecular dynamics of small molecules as well, and sort of docking of small molecules in their target receptor enzyme, and that's actually been fairly fruitful for us. I'd say the generative AI stuff is still getting off the ground. Still feels a little bit like a random number generator that just throws out bad ideas and you end up not making half of them. But it's improving faster than I think most people realize. And so it's like one of those things that if you look in a short period of time, you won't see much change. But if you look over the course of a decade, I think you'll see that the field has shifted dramatically in terms of how we do things. I don't think we're in any danger of AI and ML replacing researchers yet, but in the long term, I think it could replace some of the more mundane work that we probably don't want to be doing. And I definitely see that in this sort of biophysical application that's already happening.
Does that track with some of the industry work you've been doing, Vince?
Yeah, I mean, so previously was in an RNA startup out of WashU, St. Louis, and we definitely leveraged AI with regard to biomarker discovery and allowed us to, pretty quickly identify patterns with regard to what markers were of interest for detection of GI disease activity, whether it be Crohn's or inflammatory bowel disease, and so allow us to pretty quickly hone in on 35, 40 different biomarkers of interest that were not previously understood to have really clinical relevance. And so definitely very powerful tools that can be leveraged for assay development and ultimately target therapeutic targets.
Are any of you thinking or concerned about any kind of safeguards in terms of privacy and security issues or other ethical concerns as we start to see this convergence of all these different data sets and technology that can go so fast? Is that on your radars? Joanna?
Say absolutely. I think for us who consent numerous human subjects for research, that is an area where we have to disclose the potential loss of privacy for many of our participants in clinical trials and human subjects research. I think there are also some populations, vulnerable populations, that where we cannot use AI because of the risk. It's just not acceptable. So I think the ethics of using new technologies are always open for discussion and important, and those are two areas. I'd also say privacy for legal discussions. There are other places where we often think about doing things the old-fashioned way. But I would also say for our surgeons and our very procedural types of physicians and physician researchers, for them, the new technologies, machine learning and AI, are immensely powerful, and they really will enable savings of time, money, recovery time for patients that are immensely valuable.
Vince, you're nodding a lot. We want to...
Well, I was maybe going to put a plug for my alma mater. Notre Dame has got a center of, they're kind of, really developing a center of excellence with regard to ethics in terms of application technology, and are investing heavily with regard to recruiting faculty and publishing a lot in that area. So I think that's maybe still in the corridor and can be, partnerships to be able to suss out both the hard science and also the soft science of the discoveries that we're driving into the clinic.
What do you see as maybe we'll start down with Andrew, but what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles for our region that we need to knock down if we're going to really drive a kind of globally competitive state for the work we're doing?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple. I think one is around talent, right? It's about making sure we have the right people working here in Indiana and Illinois and along the corridor. We train a lot of the best people in the world, and the most talented folks come here to learn, but then oftentimes, I think at least historically, they've then taken those talents to the East Coast or the West Coast and sort of exported. What we need to do, I think, and we've been working really hard on this, obviously, at Lilly, is find ways to make this an attractive place, not just to train, but also to sort of raise your family, live your life, and grow your career in the longer term. And I think if we can make those investments that sort of people realize this is a great place not only to train, but also to live, then I think that's going to help us a lot in terms of bridging that particular talent challenge. It's an ongoing one, and I think there's a lot of money on the East Coast and the West Coast, but I think we do have a lot of things that are unique to add here, right? it's much easier to have a comfortable life with your family in the Midwest than it is on the East Coast in Boston today. Like, you can have a good school district and a reasonable house at the salary that you can actually afford them. So we've found that to be a reason that folks stay. But also, I think because of some of these connections that we have growing with a lot of the universities and the now sort of growing biotech industry that we have here in Indiana and in Illinois as well. So I do think that we're sort of starting to find ways to hold people here. I think the other one is sort of that connectivity more broadly to the coasts, and I think at Lilly we're working on that. You know, we have a new building that I lead in the seaport in Boston, and we're having people come back and forth, and so we're getting a lot of connection to companies on the East Coast coming here and then working with us here in Indianapolis, and then also sending folks from Indianapolis out to the East Coast to train as well. So I think really retaining people and then attracting sort of collaboration and talent are the two things that are most important, I think, to me.
And you all also have, is it called the Gateway?
Yeah, the Gateway
on the
Labs.
West Coast?
Yeah, it's an interesting experiment because for the first time, so usually what we do is kind of like J Labs. We have a building where people come with their startup and it's a separate site. At the site that we have in the seaport, we actually put that incubator in the middle of the Lilly building. So it's on sort of the 3rd and 4th floors of a 12-floor Lilly building. And so in the lunchroom, you can bump into people who work in the startups and people who work at Lilly. It's a lot more training in terms of information security, but at the same time, I think sort of enables these kinds of chance interactions that are usually what spark the most interesting scientific discoveries. So we've found that to be so far a really interesting new model, but we'll have to see long term if that results in the kinds of portfolio breakthroughs that patients are hoping for.
Okay.
I think the Midwest is a little too modest about the assets that it has. We tend to think that what we do will portray us in a good light and people will recognize our excellence, but I think marketing is a really key ingredient to bringing a larger workforce here and making the Midwest be appreciated for the quality of life, the collegiality, and the opportunities that exist here. And so I think a good marketing PR investment would be key.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I've heard that for a number of years in terms of, being too humble and all that. There may be some of that, but I got to tell you, I think that there is a lot of folks that we run into that are proud and very aggressive in talking about the success of our region. So I agree we need to maybe push harder, but I think we're starting to get over that. I'd like to get to the point where no one ever thinks of that. They just think, yeah, there's this kick-ass stuff going on in the Midwest. They know what they're doing. We should be there and be proud of it. Are there other, and I've got kids that are like in their 20s, and we think a lot about keeping people here, but it seems like it's the opportunities. I mean, where are those opportunities to really dig into some of the most advances that, cutting edge work that is just mind-blowing that people want to be around? I mean, where do you see those activities here? We'll start with you, Joanna, in our region.
Well, I think we heard a lot about them earlier today,
Yeah.
for sure. I also think there are tremendous advantages in some of the large collaborations in the region, and one of them is Renew. It's one of the NSF engines that was funded about a year ago. It includes almost all the university partners in this region. It includes Argonne National Lab. It's also a 6-state partnership, and it addresses how we look at sustainability in the Great Lakes region, which is part of our larger ecosystem of water. It facilitates the water economy. It facilitates water sustainability. It's a very huge and should be attractive way to bring people here to work and to face a big question, which has to do with water usage, water health, the water economy, and the sustainability of this part of the country upon which much rests, I think, especially, as was mentioned, agricultural assets.
Yeah, and by water, are you talking Great Lakes and the river systems? Yeah, it is a heck of an asset. I mean, I won't go into a bunch of stories there, but it's something that's near and dear to many people in my life's hearts. Do you, I'm sorry. You just,
Yeah, I was just going to kind of build on Joanna's earlier comment with regard to marketing. I think it is about, and to your point too, John, is I think it's about like focusing the messaging around like what are we, in your terms, kick ass in, right? So like we don't, I think our best chance as a geographic region is to not try to be all things to all people, but be really focused on like where can we be the epicenter of the world around. That if you are wanting to do cutting edge research in fill in the blank, Alzheimer's or cardiometabolic or nuclear medicine, there's no better place to be than in the Midwest, or in our instance, Indiana, because of the thought leadership that sits at Stark Neuroscience Center at IU School of Medicine, or Dr. Phil Lau down the street, that has founded so many companies, or Richard DeMarchi down in Bloomington, who's founded so many companies. So there's like titans of thought leadership that we can build upon, and if we align our investments accordingly, we can build upon the substrate that's here in these areas of existing strengths and really double down on these areas, whether it be radiopharmaceuticals, neurodegenerative disease, cardiometabolic, and then orthopedics, and contract manufacturing for Indiana. Those would be like the 5 crown jewels that I think we have opportunity as a community to really, focus our investments at the universities, and that then will draw industry to come to create discovery and research teams that want to be in close proximity to those thought leaders. And I think that's a strategy that I think helped make Boston what Boston is back in the early 90s, when there was so much research being done at Dana-Farber or the Broad Institute around cancer biology, and research that was led to targeted therapies, EGFR, HER2, ALK, et cetera, and immunotherapies that led to so much biotech activity in Boston. I think we can take a page of that playbook and do that here in the Midwest, and I think have parallel kind of success, but in those other areas besides cancer.
So I think one of the things that we need to do as an ecosystem is invest more in early stage startups. I may be biased, but the simple reality is when I was training here in the Midwest, I surrounded myself with ambitious people, right? And I think we're all sort of aligned that we have great universities, great institutions in this area with a lot of really great talent is created. But what happens is ambitious people want to work ambitious jobs, and they tend to gravitate towards startup. And those startups are primarily concentrated on the coast in areas like Cambridge, Boston, or out in the Bay Area. I mean, I see it as an opportunity as a founder to be able to capture and retain this talent, as long as I have sort of that funding and the support from the ecosystem to make it all happen. I'm thankful for increased federal investment. I'm thankful for state level investment, but we still need more. Venture capital is not friendly to deep tech companies where the timelines are really long.
yeah, I'm sure, Vince, you can talk to this as well, but I know I saw someone here earlier from M25 and some other groups that are invested, Elevate, and others who are invested. But when we start talking about biosciences, when we start talking about these regulated industries, the runway is just so freaking long. We run where I'm from. We have a fund that focuses on early stage companies, but they're almost all kind of software based platforms. They're most of them are not regulated industries. I mean, how do we bring that kind of muscle to the early stage investing that has deep enough pockets to sustain these early stage companies through the different cycles of regulatory review? I mean, it seems like that's a little bit of a hill that we still need to climb in our region. Maybe different in Illinois than what I'm familiar with here in Indiana.
I think there is a bit of risk aversion in Midwest, and so, but I think there's some good ongoing efforts with regard to certainly work that Kristen and Elevate have done have filled a real important void We're raising another seed fund ourselves to try to provide critical capital, and happily one of our portcos from a prior fund filed for an IPO a couple weeks ago. So that's going to be a really nice outcome for the Indiana investment community. But I think having folks who have good exits, and then or folks that have enjoyed the stock appreciation at Lilly and maybe have retired from Lilly, can reinvest into the ecosystem. Or seeing some of that as well. So I think we're at a nice. Some things are kind of beginning to converge that allows us to be more optimistic about the availability of capital. But certainly growth capital is challenging. To have the folks that can write a $25, $30 million check, there's not many of those around. But hats off to Elevate for having organizations like events like Rally that can bring the Frasers and the 5 a.m.s and the OrbiMeds or Stiefel to Indianapolis to give them exposure to some of the science and the founding teams that are trying to make it go in Central Indiana.
So I think one of these things, to circle back on sort of marketing, we do need to do a better job of this culturally in the Midwest. I don't think that it's humility necessarily. I think that we're very grounded in reality. It's remarkable every time I'm out in the Bay Area, hearing sort of founders over their pitch, especially deep tech founders. They're promising the moon and the stars, and we just don't quite do that in the Midwest. We're really focused on what's real, not getting carried away in a lot of hype. And there's a balance that we need to find there, and we need to strike there, where we're talking about our strengths, the fact that we can do more with less capital, the fact that there's a ton of amazing talent here, and we just need to figure out how do we do an effective job of that.
Joanna, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I was going to give the example of Deerfield Partners. So it's an investment firm. They choose a number of academic partners across the United States. Northwestern was one, University of Illinois, Chicago was another. It's a way of getting capital, but I'm not convinced it works beautifully. But it's just a new model for saying, we'll fund an LLC with your university. We will commit up to $65 million to invest in your startups, but we want to see them up front, and we want to look at them, and we'll give advice pragmatically and also access to kind of their contract research organizational core facilities. And so it sort of works. I think we all had higher hopes that it might do a little more effective job of bringing some startups forward, but at least for our university, we have one that's moving forward now, and I think that's a good thing. There's also a lot of entrepreneurial instruction for startups, which I think is often one of the failures of the academic institutions. You have to draw someone in to help you facilitate this part of your portfolio. And so this was like a built-in mentoring, more of a tease for funding, but it had legs. There's probably a new version of that. So that experimentation on how do you facilitate the development of entrepreneurial successes is important. And we're always open to trying new ways of doing that.
Great.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and what we're doing in Central Indiana, or Indiana writ large, is bringing together the various innovation offices, or TTOs, across the universities. There's great work being done at Purdue Innovates and Indiana Innovates and IU School, the Office of Research, or Idea Center Notre Dame, and then Elevate Ventures, and there's a lot of players in the innovation ecosystem. And so what we try to do as BioCrossroads is bring together and create a community of practice, if you will, to at least look for collaborations. If there's going to be redundancy in programs, at least it's intentional as opposed to happenstance. Look for opportunities to partner, share best practices, and then I think have the opportunity to speak with a unified voice out to the external community as well from a marketing perspective, and do some things jointly with regard to outreach to capital that's in Boston or in the Bay Area. And so part of that effort, we just kicked this off 3 months ago. We've tried to create a fact base as to what are the 7 or 8 different metrics and indices of innovation in the life science ecosystem, whether it be NIH funding per GDP, state R&D funding, extramural research funding, SBIR, grant volume and success rate, VC that's been raised, exits that were achieved, and number of jobs in life sciences, and be able to benchmark Indiana against the 50 other 49 states and DC, and really allows us as a group to really hone in on where are we leading and where are we lagging. And actually, Illinois' profile is very similar to Indiana. It's really quite interesting how we lead and lag in kind of similar areas, where I think then lends itself to potential more collaboration between the states, because I think what would help Indiana would help Illinois and vice versa.
Absolutely, and it's we have the federally designated tech hub in Indiana in the Bioworks area. Illinois has I think at least one, maybe in the quantum area. And then Wisconsin, there's a biotech related regional tech hub as well. It seems like when we think about radical collaboration, thinking big is where it's at, right? I mean, we don't always have a great history of that here in Indiana and across the country, because it just seems like in the economic development world, so many people operate from like a scarcity mentality. It's more competitive than collaborative, and it seems like we're making some real progress over, getting over that and learning that there really is strength in numbers. The more we do together, the better we're going to be. I ran into someone earlier who used to be in the military, and their lesson on day one was that as long as nobody's worried about who gets the credit, we're going to do great things. And it just seems like we're coming into an environment where we're getting better at that. And I was just going to, in the time we have left, maybe do a lightning round, maybe starting with you, Adam, in terms of what, in your experience, what has been the best collab that you've experienced and why, in terms of these cross-industry collaboration?
Probably during COVID, I was responsible for Lilly's COVID antibody project, so the therapies we developed for COVID, there were 3 of them. And the interesting thing with those antibodies was we collaborated with biotechs, with AbCellera and with Junshi to bring in new antibodies. We collaborated with the NIH, with the FDA, and it sort of showed me like what happens when you turn everyone's engagement up to 100%, because this was like prior to the vaccines coming out, so everyone was still terrified, and we were working sort of day and night to try and find an answer for people.
Some of us still are.
It doesn't seem to go away. But the interesting thing was just sort of like with that 100% engagement, what usually takes us several years to develop an antibody and get it to the clinic, we did in 6 months. So when I look back on that time, we're always sort of trying to say, like, we never want to do that again. It was like probably the most rewarding thing that I've ever done at work, but I never want to do it again. But there are probably lessons that we can learn from COVID and from those collaborations during COVID to accelerate medicines for things like diabetes and Alzheimer's and obesity.
Do you have an example from your end here, Joanna?
I'm sorry, I was having flashbacks about COVID.
Sorry.
But I too agree, there's nothing like a crisis to bring people together. And I would say that for us, it was the partnerships with the large pharmaceutical firms that had vaccines and therapies that allowed us to do the clinical trials and to really bring data that might not represent the full suite of all Americans to the table to learn what actually worked and what didn't. And I would say also that providing the clinical trial data for vaccinations and for testing, those were 2 other things that were big, large collaborations that we accomplished because of the need, and then those barriers kind of fell. And there was a really great entrepreneurial and pragmatic spirit that got things done.
That's great.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm really excited about future collaborations that are going to happen. I'm seeing that from my perspective, there's a lot of funding that's been enabled in part by things like the CHIPS and Science Act. And not only is the federal government, investing large sums of money, but there's intentionality around let's get startups, let's get early stage companies involved. So we've got a couple of things on our radar at STEM Loop that we're really excited about, working sort of across institutions, public, private, government, nonprofit, et cetera.
That's great. Time's up, but do you want the last word, Vince?
No, I won't keep people from the
Yeah, they
closer
just
to
brought out cookies.
cocktail.
We're
Yeah,
not going to
exactly.
get in the way of that. Anyway, join me in thanking our panel today. Really appreciate your comments.